on behalf of the American Sephardi Federation Institute of Jewish Experience and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs of Yeshiva University. And now I will take off this. So today we're very excited to have Professor David Koffman and Professor Yolande Cohen. And they were part of an interesting project here that resulted in this book, No Better Home, ? I want to make sure that you get the question mark, because I think that's a big part of what is going on here. First of all, what is a good home? What makes it a good home? And is Canada actually representative of it? So I'm going to let them talk about it, but I just want you to start thinking about it as I'm going to introduce everybody. So there's part of the book talks about multiculturalism in Canada, everywhere from Ukrainians to Jewish indigenous encounters. There's a lot going on here. We're going to obviously focus more on the Sephardi section of the book, but I'm hoping that Professor Koffman will at least give us a little overview of it, as this is really his project. And I want to make sure that I introduce them formally before I allow them to talk. So as the editor of this impressive volume, Professor Richard Koffman gathered scholars to explore the breadth and depth of the Canadian Jewish experience. He is the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry, and if I'm saying anything wrong, you'll let me know. An associate professor in the Department of History, and is a cultural and social historian of modern Jewish life with a specialization in Canadian and US Jewries. He's going to give us an introduction to the Canadian Jewish world, one that has a strong infrastructure to assist with Jews across the board. And it always amazes me what is in Canada, particularly growing up between Chicago and Cleveland, which I think has a huge Jewish community, each of them, and doesn't quite have the infrastructure that I've seen, at least in Toronto and Montreal, but I'll let you talk about that. Professor Yolande Cohen has been a professor of contemporary history at the University of Quebec in Montreal since 1976. Specializing in the history of women and migration, she heads the History, Women, Gender, and Migration Research Group. She's also conducted research on the large Moroccan and North African community in Montreal. In this volume, she writes My Canadian Experience as a Moroccan Jew, and shares her parts of her life from Meknes through France to Montreal. And as I'm definitely not the expert on Canadian Jewry, and you came to talk about Canadian Jewry, I'm going to hand the stage over. Again, I will be in the background throughout, so please do put questions, comments in the chat, in the Q&A, and I will be monitoring it. And I will hand the stage over to Professor Koffman.
Great. So I thought, maybe thinking out loud here, maybe I'll speak a little bit about the title and the book as a project. And then Yolande, maybe you'll speak about your contribution. I'll speak about my contribution, speak a little bit about what else is in the book, and then we can field questions. So the book came about after a conference that we put on at York University in Toronto in 2017, which was the 150th anniversary of Canadian Confederation of Canada becoming a state, the sesquicentennial. And I thought it would be an interesting thing to gather scholars to sort of think about Canada as a home for the Jews in broad terms, and to kind of capture something of the moment of what were being called the cerebrations, not celebrations, but cerebrations, kind of thinking through Canadian life at a sort of reflection point for Canada itself, which has got a lot of critical self-reflection going on now, as many other countries are. And the idea was to gather some of the leading scholars of Canadian Jewish life together with other scholars who had not yet written about Canada professionally, but either have lived and taught in Canada for a long time and have something to say, or Canadian-born modern Jewish studies scholars in different fields that left Canada and found their specializations elsewhere, and to ask them to sort of contemplate Canadian Jewish life from some specific angle. So the title of the book is a little bit cheeky, this No Better Home with a question mark. I did not mean it to be a pietistic kind of claim. As you probably know, there have been many efforts in many countries around the world for its Jews to basically write apologetic, contributionalist essays and declare the home in which they live the best place for Jews ever. And this is part of a political process of ingratiating the community to political leadership, something similar to the prayers that Jews have written and contribute in their Siddurim and Machzorim, where they pray and praise their government and the Queen and whoever else they meant to praise. This was not meant to be that. This was just meant to actually be a genuine question about the role of appreciation that scholars may take in thinking about national Jewish lives. Is there a place to appreciate and to celebrate? What is that place for scholars? And really just to think critically from multiple different perspectives about Canadian Jewish life very broadly. So the result was an interesting symposium and then an expansion and a book that contains, I guess, 18 or 19 essays from different scholars from a range of academic disciplines, tackling some aspect of the idea of home and providing some reflections on it. The introduction spells out an argument for why asking if there's ever been a better place for the Jews than Canada is a reasonable intellectual question to ask. And it's partly because of the kind of lack of political or physical molestation that Jews suffer in Canada and have ever suffered, despite some periods of fairly intense anti-Semitism and immigration restriction. But also that that it ought to be a comparative question. Now, this book doesn't do any of the work of comparing Jewish life in Canada with other countries, although there is a new book for anyone interested that's on its way out called Jewish Life in Canada Compared or something like that, Canadian Jews Compared. That will be coming out next year, edited by Bob Brim and Randy Schnur. But this was more of an internal discussion about different elements of the Canadian Jewish population, interactions between Jews and non-Jews, some reflections about literary productions and how writers of various sorts through the world of Canadian letters have contemplated their place here, and other kind of theme and variation on the big question of home. I'll just introduce your piece, Yolande, but you should speak about it. I wanted Yolande to write about Sephardic life in Canada, and she's written quite a bit about Sephardic life in Canada. And after some discussion, we settled on a kind of personal essay that she's written, where she kind of tells the story of Sephardic Canadian Jewish history through her own personal lens, and kind of weaves tacks back and forth between her personal narrative and some broader contextualization about the broader experience. So maybe you'll tell us more about what you wrote and why you wrote it and what you think of what you wrote after it was published.
Right. Thank you so much, David. And thank you, Drora, for convening us for this discussion around this book. I think it's a very timely moment to discuss all those questions, as home is ever an elusive question for Jews. Of course, the natural or the Zionist home should be Israel. And for a long time, Moroccan Jews in particular had been thinking and praying, and as David said, praying both for their utopian home in Jerusalem, while being in Morocco and praying for the king. And all my youth, I heard both those stories and both those prayers as defining elements of my identity. But yet, I was living in a protectorate, a French protectorate, where I was neither speaking Hebrew, neither speaking Arabic, or at least I was speaking Judeo-Arabic with my relatives, essentially my grandmother, who was not speaking any other language than the Judeo-Arabic. And here I was, totally a French person, being at these French schools, not the Alliance school, but the French school of the French protectorate in Morocco, and not understanding exactly where my home was, while my parents were not feeling at home in Morocco anymore after the Shoah and after the creation of Israel. Our home in Meknes was not anymore our home, because they were constantly wondering where they would go. And I grew up, even though I was born not in Morocco, but in France, in a transit camp or a refugee camp, really, where they were transiting to go to Israel, where my father's family had been. It was very difficult for them. And I understand that now, much, much later, how difficult it was for them to realize where their home was really, because they started this long migration process as soon as they got married, and they were 20 at that time. So the Vichy regime was really probably for them, when they were in their youth, a moment of total realization that the French that they were expecting to be their home, the French or the French language that they were speaking, was not that. The Vichy regime had incredible effects on my parents. My mother couldn't go to her school because there was this numerus clausus, which is a number imposed of the numbers of Jews that were allowed to stay at school, and she was not part of this number. So she had to quit school at 16, even though she was an excellent student and she was really speaking perfect French. And even in the École des Alliances, which were more or less protected by the king, the protection didn't apply to her. And my father quit school as well when he was 15. So for them, life was already shattered, and their ambitions of becoming, of even going to school was not functioning anymore in Morocco. So I think, being my father being the younger brother of this whole family, they had to start moving from Meknes, which was the place of their birth for more than 2,000 years, and their families were there. The Cohen and Berdugo families were settled in Meknes forever. And still, they decided that they were going to be the one emigrating. So a first emigration in 48 that didn't arrive finally to Israel. They stayed 3 years in Marseille in those camps, and I was born there, and came back to Meknes. And that first immigration settled, I think now that I recollect these moments, settled for them a path of migration that would just bring them to not to France like other brothers of my father's, but to Montreal. But only in 74 they arrived to Montreal because my mother's sister and her sons were already established since the 1960s. So it's I go in detail into this story because it's very typical of many of those Europeanized Jews that arrived to Montreal and that didn't go to France. And that is, in itself is very interesting because France, even though it was a protectorate for more than 50 years in Morocco, didn't allow the Moroccan Jews to become French citizens. So they became really not, I don't think, I wouldn't apply the Hannah Arendt adjective of pariah, because they were Moroccan citizens. When Morocco became independent, the king gave them the citizenship of Morocco, which was very important. And that's why they were staying in Morocco longer than any other place after the creation of Israel. But most of the indigenous Moroccan Jews, since 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel, went to Israel, part thanks to the Zionist ideal that they were sharing, but also part, and now we're knowing much more about it, a part of the action of the International Philanthropic Association, such as the Joint and Agence Juive, and in the case of Moroccan Jews in Montreal and Canada, the JAIAS. So those organizations, feeling the burden of having to save the Jews in the world after the Holocaust, immediately started a very vast intervention in Arabo-Muslim countries to save the Jews and to make them migrate either to Israel or to the countries like Canada and even Argentina and Latin America. So this is a story where home is very elusive. It's a very difficult word to apply to those Sephardic communities that had been already chased from Spain and Portugal in the 15th century. So this is a story still. And my contribution to this book, I'm sorry to be so long, but I'll stop in a moment. Just finishing up with my contribution to the book is mostly the story, my story, and the settling in Montreal. Because as David mentioned, this is a discussion. Unfortunately, I was not part of the conference, but this is a discussion that we want to have amongst Canadian historians. And in the book, there is this very interesting paper also of our colleague saying, I mean, how can you, Canadian, even dare thinking that you might be a home for Jews where you have the US, which is the only place where the Jews want to be, or think of wanting to be. Anyway, this is another story, but obviously being the Canadian little brother of the American Jewish organization, it's still interesting. And I thought the book is really an interesting opening to a discussion of how multiculturalism in Canada had been encouraging Sephardic Jews to establish themselves in French and establish their own organization and strive as a community in Canada, and probably much more so than in the US. I was just in the West Coast where you have an organization, but not that kind of organization where they kept their own languages, as we do still in Montreal, where we have a strong organization in schooling system in French. And it's almost as if the Alliance Israélite Universelle and their schools are re-establishing themselves in Canada. So I think it's an interesting place to be. And do I call it home? at the end of my paper, I certainly was able to say, yes, Montreal is my home now. My kids had been born here, and I'm not sure if they're going to settle here. They're still, wondering, but still, for me, I can say that it's certainly a very I'm very grateful to be able to be teaching and living in Montreal. So yes, if I can give an answer, I'm torn. I go very often to Morocco. I was in a conference with Moroccan colleagues. I have very, very deep and important relationship with Moroccan colleagues and affection for Morocco. And it's probably a very unique possibility that Moroccan Jews have. And now with the opening with Israel, it's even much more so. But still, I'm quite happy to be, even in this cold Montreal, I'm quite happy to be living here. Thank you.
Yolande, can I ask a quick follow-up question, and then I'll take a short turn. I was wondering about Moroccan communities, Moroccan Jewish communities in, say, Argentina or Mexico City or in the US. There's obviously a number of organizations and attempts to form either kind of sub-ethnic groups or pan-Sephardic groups. But as far as I know, these have all happened in the lingua franca. They've happened in Spanish in Argentina. And so do you think, other than in France, of course, is Canada the only place where Moroccan Jewish life has continued in French?
It's not the only place, but it's a major place. And of course, in Morocco, we had a double protectorate. In the north of Morocco, we had Spain, which was Frankish Spain, and a very difficult protectorate, and the French one. And the Spanish part of Morocco had been very, very active into establishing their own communities in Spanish, which was their language. And Judeo-Spanish is really quite important. Plus, I must say, and we had been talking about that with colleagues working on Argentinian Jews, they migrated before the Moroccan Jews came, the post-colonial immigration. They migrated at the end of the 19th century. So this gave them a much different outlook of the way in which they settled, and it's a different story altogether. And yes, it's a very interesting story, but in many ways different, because they had organization, culture, rituals that were their own, even in Morocco. And it's a big divide between those two communities. And in Toronto, it's very interesting that in Toronto, where they met, the same division, linguistic division, happened, and now they organized into different communities. The Kehila Center is more francophone, and the others are more anglophone and Spanish speaking. Although the Spanish is disappearing quickly in the anglophone setup.
Yeah, the sort of two communities with radically different migration moments might be comparable to the Russian Jews in Canada who came, pre-war Russian Jews, and post-Soviet Jews who came in the 1970s and 80s. They're both Russian Jews, but these are radically different communities.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Because they are the one that arrived in Argentina mainly, and a little bit in Brazil, but in Argentina essentially, and Mexico at the end of the 19th century, they are autochthon. They are the founders of those communities. So they're looking at the newcomers in a very different way.
I'm going to just put in the chat here the the book link. And I also am going to, if this works, it doesn't. But if you click on the book link, you can see on the page where it says contents, you can see the table of contents and have a sense of all the many different kinds of contributions, if some of them are more interesting than others to you. I'll just say quickly about my own contribution. It's an essay that tries to reimagine what Canadian Jewish history as a whole looks like if we take the encounter between Jewish immigrants and Indigenous people seriously. As some of you may know, the kind of conversation about Indigenous reconciliation in Canada, relationships between what are called settlers, meaning anyone who's not an Indigenous person, and Indigenous First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada, that sort of part of the story of contemporary national reckoning of what it looks like. So I attempt in this essay to show that there's been a continuous set of engagements, practical face-to-face engagements with Indigenous people since the first arrival of Jews in what would become Canada before Canada was even confederated. And there really runs all the way up until the present, and asks, it's called the settling and unsettling. So if it's a meditation on the idea of home for immigrants, it is a slightly more complicated version of this history that I'm suggesting that needs to be taken into account, given that Jewish immigrant settler communities, people who moved from many other countries and hope to establish a permanent foothold and establish all the institutions of Jewish life and participate in the civic and national project of Canada, were also ipso facto part of a colonial process. And I ask the question, or kind of try to force the reader, I suppose anyone who's reading, to grapple with the fact that immigration history is also part of colonial history, and what's the nature of this relationship for Jews in particular, even for Jews who arrived long after the original so-called colonial period, but still build their lives and communities in a place where colonialism is an ongoing process, in the language of Indigenous thinkers. So it's also not a straight answer, yes, yay, Canada, best home. Yolande does conclude her essay with something of an answer to the question, but as she also said, it's really a kind of a struggle where home maybe isn't the most appropriate word. And likewise, if we think about Canadian Jewish life through the kind of lens of global colonial, settler colonial movements of derivative empire, where community empires settle and then establish roots, then we also have a slightly more complicated version of home.
So thank you both very much for the introduction here and the overview. I want to ask, just before I get into Carolyn's question, and please do put your questions in the chat, but I was having an interesting talk with a friend of mine the other day, who's a curator and an ethnographer, and she specifically said that she was trained not to research your own community. And you both kind of chose to research within your own communities. I wonder if you could just expand a little bit about the positives and negatives that you see. I mean, I guess you moved into the Indigenous community also, which I'm assuming is not your native community, but it's still the relationship between the Jews and the Indigenous, and but between the female and Moroccan. So you've really kept within your own. So if you could just talk a little bit about you feel the benefits and problems.
I had a colleague way back 30 years ago who was asking me the same question when I started doing gender history. He was an older colleague, and at that moment I was really very shocked, because I thought, yes, maybe I shouldn't work on gender history after all. Who am I, etc., etc. And we had been taught, the old generation, mine, to distance ourselves from our work. And I must say, this is really a change, a sea change in social sciences that was happening in the last 20 or 25 years to do exactly the opposite. And the cultural appropriation story and the fact that we can't know more about something that we didn't live in are the exact opposite of the objectivity that we want to have from social scientists, that the so-called social scientists had. But of course, the feminist studies had been showing that this objectivity had been leading them to forget completely about the woman and about the gender and about the vulnerable people. So at one point, it went hand in hand, this change of perspective that we call the standpoint theory in gender studies, which allows you and ask the researcher to establish their own standpoint and where are they talking from and what are they looking at, because our own subjectivity is definitely in charge in social sciences of what we see. And most of the time, we don't see what other people, vulnerable people, are seeing. And if you're looking at Black studies and Black feminists, they exactly say that they are under the ceiling. They are not even in the glass ceiling. They are under the cement because we don't even look at them. So they are trying to change that. Indigenous people are trying to change that by establishing their own lives and old stories, and oral history is doing that. But at the same time, I would say, for my own perspective, I'm welcoming this perspective, but always with the important aspect of how do you say, of croiser, how do you say, of using different ways of multiplying the angles of view, so that own standpoint is not the only one that you're looking at. And so this is the way. For instance, David had been working on indigenous, but the way in which, but I'll let him explain, the way in which he's doing that is not, he's not taking the standpoint of indigenous, but his own, and trying to open up the standpoint to other perspectives is the work that I think we should do as historians. So thank you for this question. It's a very important question. From my own point of view, is that trying to, at the same time, having my standpoint, but also the one that is arising from others, like other oral history that I'm doing, and using their own perspective to enlighten my own.
I could just add a quick response to the question too. So Jewish studies is a little bit of an outlier in the long history of the humanities and social sciences, insofar as Jewish studies has almost always been done by Jews. There was something like Jewish studies that studied, in the academy in the 19th century in Europe, where scholars were interested in the Hebrew Bible and in other kind of classic Jewish texts taught, and they of course taught in universities, which were then Christian seminaries, Christians teaching to other Christians who are interested in teaching the Hebrew Bible. But as soon as Jewish studies kind of per se hit the university scene in Europe and in North America, it was almost exclusively by Jews. And it remained so when the discipline of Jewish studies developed much more intensely in the 1960s and 70s. And interestingly, only in the last maybe 10, 12, 15, 20 years have non-Jews begun to be interested and participate as active scholars in Jewish studies. And so Jewish studies as a kind of academic pursuit has had to push pause on its assumption that its scholars would be fellow Jews and would have to make room and kind of remove themselves a little bit more than they had been by default to consider the perspectives of non-Jewish scholars. So a great, just quick example of this in Canada is that there is a real efflorescence of interest in Jewish life in Quebec from non-Jewish Quebec historians, Francophone Quebecers who are interested in the history of Quebec. They're interested in multiculturalism, interested in religious accommodation. They're interested in the state. They're interested in a multicultural, multiracial city of Montreal, and have thought, we can't really understand our own history in Quebec without understanding Jewish history. So we're going to go learn Yiddish. We're going to do our research, and we're going to write, to Jewish studies scholars who may be interested, but more so to fellow Quebec and Canadian historians, because it matters. What the Jewish experience matters to understand the Quebec experience. So this is a pretty interesting development. And I think it's happening in other countries and other places as well. But it's a kind of different answer to the who does Jewish studies question.
Yeah.
Sorry, there are two questions in here that I kind of think can be answered together, because the question is really about the Francophone attitude of the Sephardim, and if it distances the Ashkenazim, or it makes sense for, sorry, I was back there. Here, I'm a first generation Ashkenazi Jew in Montreal who had no knowledge of English before they came. It would seem to me for a French speaking Jew, Montreal would be a natural place for immigration. Can you speak about the problem that Sephardi Jews integrating into Ashkenazi institutions? And yes. I think a lot of that has to do with language.
Yes, it has a lot to do with language, but not only, I think. It was, I think it's a difficult problem because Ashkenazi Jew and institution like JIAS, but all the others, Federation, CJA, etc., had been the host of the Moroccan. They had been really fighting to get their papers, the immigration. JIAS had been very influential into trying to find jobs for these people. And in the 60s and 70s, when they arrived, they were kind of lost. And JIAS was really very present. But at the same time that they were present and making everything they could to arrange for them to have a life, they underestimated probably, and this is always the same problem of people doing the accueil, being the host and the one that are hosted. There is a debt, a very big debt, and Marcel Mauss was probably one of the big scholars of this question of gratitude and debt and how you get into this relationship, because this is at the basis of a relation. It was an unequal relation. And this unequal relationship of the people being the host and the hosted stayed quite a long time. And in a way, the hosts didn't open up their own organization to welcome those immigrants. They were only immigrants. They were not accepted they were accepted, but they were, as immigrants, they were taken care of. So they were vulnerable. And in a way, as vulnerable people who didn't want to be victims and victimized, the first thing they did was to retreat into their own organization. And because they were speaking French, they could do so with no big problems because the Quebec society allowed them to do so. And the multicultural society, Canadian, allowed them with subsidies, with also the fact that the majority was speaking French. So very quickly, they grew their own organization away from the main Jewish organizations that were Ashkenazi. Some of them, even Moroccan Jews, some of them even went as far as becoming French sovereignist and becoming anti-Anglophone in a way. They were not anti-Jew, but they were anti-Anglophone, asserting in this fight between Anglophone and Francophone, asserting their own identity. So in a way, the fact that they did their own organization was kind of a scission, a split, which was not a big split, but a split big enough to establish two different paths of becoming Jewish in Montreal. So you had the Francophone way and you had the Anglophone way. So this split went very fast because they didn't have that much money, and they couldn't guarantee to have their own organization for so long. So in the 1980s, 90s, the Sephardic community became member of the Federation CJA, but with their own philanthropic organization, Appel Juif Unifié in French, etc., etc. So the split is not that big now, but still, because of the division of Francophone and Anglophone, you can see that it's still two different organizations.
Maybe I just add a quick comment about an extra bit of context as well. So one of the really fascinating kind of coincidences of timing is that as Sephardic Jews from Morocco and Algeria and some other places in North Africa, French-speaking Jews moved to Quebec, was sort of timed coincidentally at the moment, the sort of long period in Quebec history called the Quiet Revolution, which was a moment when Quebec society revisioned itself, kind of clawed back, nationalized businesses, the energy sector, sort of took a much more activist role in shaping the province and clawing back power to the secular state from the hands of the Catholic Church. And so this kind of secular, nationalist, left-leaning revolution, quiet revolution, it was a revolution that had a little bit of violence, but not that much, was a moment of reckoning for Jews in the province. And I think one of the questions also sort of asked about Jewish migration from Montreal to Toronto. So this is the same moment when Anglophone Jews and the dominant Anglophone community of Jews who had sided, in a sense, for 100 years with the Protestant English-speaking minority in Quebec that had more power than the Catholic French-speaking minority. And yet at this moment of the Quiet Revolution, when Francophone independence and nationalism was on the rise, had a real reckoning about how to fit itself into a Quebec that was really changing quite rapidly. And it was at this exact moment that the new influx of French-speaking North African Jews were arriving. So there was actually some overlap. Yes, what Yolande said was perfectly right about these, two kind of sets of institutions. But there was a real effort from some of the established Anglophone Jews to incorporate and let the Sephardic Jews take some of the lead because they were better at French, and not just out represent themselves, but represent all the Jews of Quebec in producing rapprochement between Jews and the new Francophone dominant Francophone ascendant majority. So this is part of the story. Some Anglophone speaking Jews, of course, did leave Montreal, and that changed the power balance between the remaining Ashkenazim and the more culturally ascendant French-speaking Jews from Morocco. So this is a really, really quite fascinating period that, like many periods, is just a confluence of timing. It just happened to be that way.
And the change also between Montreal as the capital of Judaism to Toronto, which became the most important and in numbers, but also in influence, became the major center of Jewish life, whereas it was Montreal before that. So yes, it was this whole thing altogether.
Sorry about that. You see the strength of the Moroccan Jews in Canada, because that's who we're talking about here, even though there's a very large very strong Spanish Portuguese and historical Spanish Portuguese community, definitely in Montreal, but there's also in Toronto.
The oldest synagogue in Canada is Sharif Israel, the Spanish Portuguese synagogue, although that was founded by Ashkenazi Jews, right, by British Jews who just davened, who prayed with the Sephardic rite. There were Sfarad Jews, but not actually Sephardic Jews, although they were connected to an Atlantic world where they had many more business interactions with Jews of Sephardi descent that were in colonial North America and in the Caribbean as well. So there was, but yeah, they were
Sephardi in a way. They were themselves the one that the merchants that came in Montreal were themselves originating from the old. That's why they called the Spanish and Portuguese. But this group stayed quite. This group was very influential in settling Jewishness in Montreal. And afterwards, they were, of course, overwhelmed by Russian and Eastern European Jews that arrived at the end of the 19th century and built their own synagogue, Shara Shomayim, and all the other synagogues. But it's interesting that the Sephardic Jews that arrived in the 60s went to the Sephardic synagogue and it became again another Sephardic synagogue, and the Spanish and Portuguese became, because of the Iraqi Jews and Libyan and Iranian that arrived in the 1950s, they all went to the Spanish and Portuguese. So it's
it's a great case study. No one's actually written a good history of Sharif Israel, of the Spanish Portuguese synagogue, but it does have so many different kinds of Jews that were dominant at different moments, and you can kind of tell the history of Montreal Jewry and its changes through the one synagogue, which of course changes itself over time. It's pretty interesting case study.
We did for the 250th anniversary, that was a couple of years ago, a small booklet. But it was very difficult endeavor because it was with a colleague of mine that I hired, but we have a booklet and we had started this, but I think you're right. We need a full history of this synagogue. Very interesting synagogue.
Professor Archibald, and I can't remember his last name for some reason, and I can't find it, of course, right now, but I know that he's been working on a history and kind of culture of the Spanish of Sharif Israel.
Who's that? Oh, Jim Archibald was a president.
Jim Archibald, there you go.
Jim
okay.
Archibald, he was a member with us of the steering committee for this booklet, and I will send it to you with pleasure. This booklet is published for the 250th anniversary, but it's not a real history. Not as we understand it, really.
Yolande, do you want to drop your email address in the chat in case anyone wants to?
Sure.
Tell me also, I send a follow-up email and I'm happy to share both of your emails if that's okay with those who did come and with those who didn't come. So if that's okay with both of you, let me know.
Sure.
And is it okay if I share the table of contents as well? Because I don't know if
by all means.
Excellent. So I will drop that into the follow-up email. And we are conscientious of our time today, so I will make sure to end here. But I want to thank definitely our speakers for today and our participants for today, and those who are going to watch this after because they didn't make it. But we're wishing all of you the rest of your week, the rest of your day. Have a wonderful rest of your day and week. And thank you again, and keep learning.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, David.